There we go. I think I'll start a minute or two earlier than we typically do. So good afternoon, everyone. If you tried to dial into the IRP Modeling Advisory Group webinar on reliability and other final requirements for LSE's 2022 Integrated Resource Plans, you have found the right place. My name is Nathan Barsick, Program and Project Supervisor for CPUC Energy Division's Integrated Resource Planning team. Just a quick note about scope. The slides are on the website that we're about to go through. Colleague David Withrow is sharing them right now through WebEx. We hope you can see them all. There was an email last night from our colleague James McGarry pointing you to a link on the website where you can take a look at the slides and follow along in parallel if you so choose. This webinar, as most of you just heard, is also being recorded with an intent to post that recording in the same spot on our website where these slides live. And David, if you could advance the slide. The objectives of the webinar that we're about to do are embedded in the title that I just rattled off, but we know that that title's a bit of a mouthful and there's a lot baked in there. So I'm going to try to unpack the three main things that we're trying to accomplish. The first is to provide a update on our inputs and assumptions development process. It's a little bit different and a little more limited than you've gotten used to over the previous two cycles of IRP. Second big thing we're trying to do is to discuss approaches and schedule for updating filing templates to be used for 2022 LSE IRP development. And the third thing I'm going to kind of break in two is to do two things related to reliability planning. First one is to discuss an approach and inputs for creating reliability-related filing requirements for 2022 LSE IRPs. And the second, which is a little bit more new and a little bit more blue sky, is a proposed timeline and kind of next steps for a study of the planning reserve margin and potentially leading to an update of the PRM and IRP's planning or procurement tracks. Out of scope, we have kind of a non-exhaustive list here at the bottom with two of the more obvious things. First is GHG benchmarks for individual LSE plan filings. Those I would expect a little bit later in Q2 via ruling. And second is IRP procurement program development, kind of status and approach. I'd expect another webinar later in Q2 on that. We can skip to slide 3. Some logistics, mainly around questions and how to interact over the course of this webinar. So, as per Modeling Advisory Group kind of tradition, we're here to discuss concepts, usually complicated ones that have to do with modeling analysis and promote understanding of those concepts. So for questions, and we really want to keep the door open for as much question and kind of stakeholder interaction over the next couple hours as we can, is my usual plug for please, if you're speaking up, try to keep it to clarifying questions to develop your or other people's understanding of what we're talking about, and try to stay away from advocacy. If we see things going down the advocacy route, I might cut things short here and there, just to make sure that the main mission, the main goal of today's webinar is actually accomplished. And I'm warning now that some of this stuff gets pretty technical, particularly in the reliability sections, so I hope you're ready. We do have a preference for live, call it in WebEx, interactions. So first of those would be, please try to interact verbally with us. And we've described what you should probably be used to by now in the raised hand function that WebEx provides, either through the WebEx interface itself that has a small little raised hand that looks like this, or if you're dialing in and you are phone only, using *3. We'll put priority on answering questions that have hands raised. And I'll actually be using the number of hands raised at any given time as kind of a proxy for how fast or how slow we should be going through this information. So kind of a request from me is if you feel you're going to have to ask a question at the next juncture, get your hand up right away. It'll get you online and it'll give us an idea of how better to interact with you guys. If you end up in a place where you can't raise your hand, the next best option would to actually be to use the Q&A section or Q&A function. We know that the second and last bullet here says chat, and that is a separate function. I'd like to try to steer you into Q&A because it actually makes things on our side a little bit easier, believe it or not. Last in kind of preference is written input or question later. So if for some reason you can't get your question asked today, and you really need to get input to us, there is an email address listed here that a lot of you have interacted with in the past, that you could submit something to. Just note that the things that we're describing here are things that we are looking to kind of take off and get in flight soon. So the sooner that input comes, the better. On slide 4, we have an agenda. It's broken out in basically those 3 categories that we described back in the scope slide. First presentation will be coming from Ali Ashraghi. He's IRP's lead for inputs and assumptions development, and he'll be providing a presentation on INA development. Second will be from James McGarry, IRP's planning track lead, and he'll be presenting on all of the non-reliability planning requirements that we want to discuss with you today. Third, for the reliability planning section, is a team of folks, including Neil Raffin, IRP's lead for reliability planning and procurement track, Donald Brooks, our energy resource modeling section supervisor, and then consultants Aaron Burdick and Jimmy Nelson from E3, and Kevin Carden from Astrape. I'll then be coming back to wrap up, hopefully right around 3 p.m., so that we can all go our separate ways. But just a warning that if we end up starved for time and we haven't accomplished everything we think we need to by 3 p.m., we'll have a decision to make. Our default would just be to let the webinar run a little bit long and try to get everyone's questions answered, et cetera. But we'll update more on that as we get closer to that juncture. Slides 5 and 6 contain some IRP background that I'm actually not going to bore you with right now, considering the amount of stuff that we have to get through. This should be familiar to all of you. I think you're basically all IRP professionals at this point. Slide 7, though, has a couple points on it that I do want to use to just orient where we are in an IRP right now, because we're basically just crossed from one cycle to another, and I want to make that as apparent to folks as possible. So we purposely put up the old, basically last cycle's format here to show you a couple differences and to show you how the last cycle just wrapped up. So highlighted in green are the things that the February preferred system plan decision on the 2021 PSP basically accomplished. Some reminders that beyond that green stuff, that decision also indicated things about step 1 in the upper left of basically an intent to have LSEs planned for both 38 and 30 MMT targets for this next IRP cycle, the 2022-23 IRP cycle. And crucially, for kind of the marquee item under step 2, it eliminated the reference system plan that folks have gotten used to being, the big tent pole of the first half of an IRP process. The other things in step 2 are things that, are getting going now, and we feel like we need to discuss with you, and that's a big reason for this webinar. So, without further ado, I'll introduce Ali Ashraghi, who can cover a couple of those things as they relate to the INA.
Thank you, Nathan. And good afternoon, everyone. So in this section, we briefly talk about the inputs and assumptions, aka INA development process and timing for this IRP cycle. The INA document is a reference document that we use for IRP modeling within a given cycle. Last cycle, we developed this document in 2019. This document describes key data elements, assumptions, and methodologies, including load forecast, baseline resources, candidate resources, resource cost and potentials, operating assumptions, and policy constraints, and so on. In the last IRP cycles, INA development was part of the reference system plan development. This cycle, and per the recent preferred system plan PSP decision, we are not developing a reference system plan. So we plan to have this document, the INA document for this cycle, that we can call it 2022 INA, ready to be used for developing the PSP of this cycle, 2023 PSP, and the associated TPP portfolios, which would be 2024-25 TPP portfolios. However, it is worth noting that there are near-term use cases that we need to make limited INA updates for them before we finish the whole process of developing and finalizing the INA, the 2022 INA document, which would be like a document similar to the one that we had last cycle. The first one is the filing requirement assumptions that LSEs need for developing their IRP plans in this cycle. This is going to be finalized by June 15th. My colleague James will provide more details about this process in the next section. But in terms of the input and assumption for this final requirements, staff are making limited updates for the modeling needed to develop those requirements. These include updates to load forecast to align with the 2021 IPR, inclusion of more recent weather years from 2018 to 2020 in our solar, wind, and electricity hour shapes, and finally updates to transmission constraints. There might be other updates. The overview of these updates will be provided to parties as part of the final requirements development process. The other near-term use case that we need to make limited INA updates is for developing the 2023-2024 TP portfolio. The same as final requirements, and overview of those updates also will be provided as part of the TPP development process, TPP portfolio development process. Next slide, please. So now going back to the process for developing the complete INA document for this cycle that we use for the PSP in this cycle, 2022 INA document. As the recent PSP decision has stated, a revised scoping memo will provide details on this. The Commission anticipates in issuing this memo in this quarter, Q2 2022. While the details will be provided in the revised scoping memo, staff expect to finalize the INA document in the fourth quarter of this year, which includes the stakeholder process. So, like having this timing, this would enable us to use this INA document to develop the PSP portfolio and a reference for those parties that want to do their own modeling at the same time that we develop the PSP. And finally, we plan to have MAG webinar this summer to cover some specific INA topics. This would be along the way during the summer to cover those specific topics such as new candidate resources and having the process for asking stakeholder input on those before we go through the final process of finalizing the INA document. And this is the end of this section. This was a brief overview of the INA process in this IRP cycle. If you have any questions, we will have some time. We can have those questions at the end of the next section. But now I pass it to James for the next section.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali. So moving on to the development of this cycle's planning requirements, I'm going to cover here the development of those planning requirements that are not directly related to reliability. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the filing requirement templates that LSEs will be submitting on November 1st. And like Ali just said, after I walk through a few slides, we'll stop to open things up for Q&A to discuss this content and the INA material that Ali just presented. So the individual LSE filings that make up an IRP are the means by which LSEs tell us how they plan to procure over the planning horizon, which in this cycle goes out to 2035, to meet their assigned GHG and assigned GHG reduction and reliability goals while maintaining their other regulatory requirements as required by statute. LSEs also report on other priorities and action items in their filings, such as how they plan to achieve their plans, how they plan to conduct outreach and seek input from disadvantaged communities, how their proposed portfolios will impact customer cost and rates, and potential barriers that they foresee to implementing their plans. These filings are basically how the CPUC and other stakeholders gain insight into how LSEs plan to meet state goals, and they're also what makes the IRP an interactive process, which is informed by LSE preferences and priorities rather than just being a top-down centralized planning process. LSE plans this cycle will be due on November 1st, and in accordance with the recently adopted Preferred System Plan decision, our goal is to finalize the filing requirements by June 15th. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through each of the 3 filing requirement templates that LSEs need to submit and talk about their purpose, how we evaluate those templates after submission, and preview some of the potential updates that are under consideration. So starting with the narrative template, this document is where the LSEs describe in a qualitative way their approach to the process of developing their plans, present the results of their analytical work. They demonstrate to the CPUC and stakeholders their action plans to achieve what's in their plans, and where LSEs can identify areas where commission action would support implementation of those plans. As a public-facing document, this template is the most comprehensive and accessible of the filing requirements, and it provides a great point of entry for members of the public that want to know what any given LSE is doing around procurement and to achieve state goals. The template itself is structured as a series of sections with questions and reporting requirements, and for the last 2 cycles, the Commission has used a scorecard system for each section to determine if a response is exemplary, adequate, or deficient. LSEs receiving deficient scores are then required to resubmit their responses to those sections. And our goal in designing the template is to be very specific in the wording of each section so that LSEs know exactly what information they need to provide to receive an adequate score. So as we get this template ready for the current cycle, we're going to be considering a few things. One is to make the requests for information more relevant to this cycle of IRP, and that may include adding new questions to follow up on issues that were raised in the preferred system plan decision and implementation of the IRP procurement orders. We'll also try to add greater specificity where possible so that LSEs can better understand what they'll need to submit to avoid receiving a deficient score. And in particular, we'll be looking to give LSEs more direction around how to plan for disadvantaged community impacts and disadvantaged community engagement. Next slide. The resource data template, or RDT, is an Excel file where LSEs submit contract data across the planning horizon for existing, in development, planned resources, and it provides a snapshot estimate of the LSE's energy and capacity forecast positions across the planning horizon. And this is the template that we rely on most heavily for aggregation for PSP development. And each LSE submits at least 2 RDTs, one for each greenhouse gas target. To evaluate the RDT, Energy Division staff has created a program that it calls the Resource Data Error Checking Aggregation and Reallocation Tool, or RECART, which is a Python code-based program that evaluates each template individually, aggregates them into a single file, and then it creates LSE-specific reports that identify any errors found in the RDTs. And then we contact those LSEs each time we find an error, requesting resubmission, and this process plays out repeatedly until RECART is producing error-free reports. And at that point, we're ready to move on to plan aggregation. So in terms of what we're considering for the RDT this time around, we will be looking for lessons learned from the experience of LSEs submitting RDTs last cycle, as well as the RDT v2, which is what we call the modified version of the RDTs that LSEs have been submitting as compliance filings in the procurement track of IRP. We're also working to improve the error checking macro that LSEs were able to run before their last RDT v2 submissions and potentially make the use of the macro mandatory. The macro is something that LSEs can use on their own to analyze their templates, similar to what RECART does, so they can produce error-free RDTs from the start and hopefully avoid the need for resubmissions. And then lastly, we're also going to be looking to improve the interactions between RDTs and the Clean System Power Calculator, which is the next template that I am about to describe. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the Clean System Power Calculator, or CSP for short. The CSP is an Excel-based tool for estimating the GHG and criteria pollutant emissions for LSE portfolios, which verifies that the portfolios that are included in each LSE's RDT are sufficient to meet the LSE's assigned GHG goals. We make 2 versions of the calculator available, one for each GHG target, and they're preloaded with Servum production cost modeling outputs that are used to estimate emissions on an hourly basis based on each LSE's reliance on system power in that hour. Use of these calculators are key to facilitating a common emissions accounting methodology across LSEs. When we receive the CSP submissions, staff checks each one to make sure that LSEs are using the calculators correctly meeting their GHG benchmarks. Because those calculators contain far fewer LSE entries than RDTs, staff has been able to do this manually for each LSE without needing to develop new code like Recarb. So the main update that we're making to the CSP this cycle is updating the calculator study years. The last set of calculators had 4 study years from 2020 to 2030. This time around, the study years will need to be extended out to 2035, and each study year will need to be supported by new server-based load shapes, resource shapes, and emissions factors. In addition, we're thinking about adding some simple in-template functionality so that LSEs can check that they're error-free prior to submission. And as I mentioned before, we're looking to improve the interaction between RDTs and CSPs so that it's easier for LSEs and for staff when reviewing these templates to verify that the portfolio contained in one template is the same as the portfolio contained in the other. So a quick rundown on timing before we open things up for questions. As I mentioned before, if you could move to the next slide, David. As I mentioned before, we're aiming to finalize the templates by June 15th. And when they're final, they'll be posted on the IRP website at the link here, which is the same link that the slides for this webinar are hosted. The load forecast and GHG benchmarks, as Nathan mentioned before, that LSEs will need to develop their plans will be adopted via ruling. And we're looking to finalize the benchmarks and forecast by June 15th. And I would expect that an initial ruling seeking comment on those soon. The staff is in the process now of updating these templates, and we welcome any comments or suggestions for template improvement that you'd like to provide. You can raise those today if you'd like. You can also submit those ideas to us in writing. After today, we, as Nathan mentioned, are accepting informal comments about filing templates, and I would recommend sending those sooner rather than later if you intend to do so to improve the odds that we'd be able to incorporate your ideas into the templates by June 15th. And you can submit those to the IRP data request email address. And lastly, after June 15th, like last cycle, staff will be holding informal office hours for each group of LSEs by type to answer questions about the templates and generally facilitate plan development. So with that, I will kick it back to Nathan, and I think we can open up the Q&A session.
Thanks, James. And if I'm seeing things correctly, I think we only have 3 questions right now. First of which from Brian Deering via Q&A. Brian, I'm going to take a stab at this. Please let us know through the Q&A function if it doesn't answer your question. His question is regarding IRP GHG targets. CARB scoping plan indicated a GHG target of 37 MMT for all of California. I am assuming that is for 2030, though we might have to check the link that Brian dropped in the chat. Will that lead to any updates to the GHG targets used for the PSP for this IRP cycle? Brian, my kind of quick back of the envelope math is that target would kind of fall in between the 30 and the 38 that we already stated an intention to have LSEs to file. And thus those would kind of act as bookends for such a future target to be adopted by CARB. Please let us know if you have say strong opinion about the need to model the exact CARB target, or if maybe there's some other detail that you want us to be looking at. And then David, there were 2 hands raised before, one from Miriam. You able to unmute her?
Yeah, Miriam. Hold on. There, Miriam, you're unmuted.
Miriam Macune, EQ Research, wondering whether the NQC will be used as we've been using it in the past, or whether we will attempt to model UCAP versus QC methodologies that are applicable in 2023.
Miriam, I believe your question will be answered in a future section, a little bit later on in the presentation. David, can we do Doug Carpa?
Doug, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, folks. Great seeing everybody. just had a couple of questions. The first one was around the incorporation of social cost test. I know that study came out earlier and we didn't file comments. Are we anticipating that we would comment on that, I guess, when the new scoping ruling comes out? And have you had any thoughts about what role that might play in this process? I mean, I guess for our filings, it doesn't play any role.
It's a good point. And Ali, please correct me, but I think the next juncture that you might hear about kind of the venue for that might be the upcoming scoping memo within IRP, but that there might already be a signal from IDER to consider it there. Ali, does that sound familiar?
Yeah, the next step is for IDR, the new proceeding would issue a ruling, and stakeholders can provide comments there.
In the high DER proceeding. Yeah, okay. My second question was about the INA input document. So I understand you're looking at finalizing that Q4, but the modeling inputs, those would be done in June. So I'm just kind of curious what else gets updated after that. In part, and it's what motivates the questions is we're trying to get started on our own modeling as fast as we can, and of course we have to wait for the inputs to be finalized before really launching into that. And so, am I correct in feeling that the inputs for our modeling would be done June 15th, and then we can, get launched and go off to the races?
Exactly. So the assumptions that LSEs need to develop their plans will be finalized by June 15th, but the complete INA document and all the assumptions that we would need to use for developing system level portfolio will be finalized by Q4, so we can use it for developing PSP. This includes the resource costs, like resource potential for the KAISO system level.
Right. Okay, great, awesome. And then my third question was on the templates. Are you all looking for beta testers? Because I know one of the issues we ran into, and you all ran into, you're super familiar, is just like uncovering bugs later in the process. And so I don't know if you want to do any expanded testing of templates before finalizing them, but I know that would be worthwhile. And I don't know what role if we can be helpful in that process, what that would look like. But we're just kind of thinking off the cuff there.
Maybe we could take that one offline for you, especially if it's an offer. We'd be happy to discuss.
Yeah, I hesitate to make offers because of the people who'd be actually doing that testing. It's not me. But yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I will mention, unlike last cycle, we're not creating brand new templates. The ones I just talked about will be incremental to what we've done before. So in the near term, if you have, ideas or suggestions based on your, experience with the template so far, send those over, and then,
okay.
we can discuss the final templates.
You bet. Will do.
Thanks, Doug. David, can we go to Scott?
Scott Olson? Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead, Scott.
Guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So Scott Olson with NRG. So James, on the CSP, I didn't see anything listed about any analytical changes that are being proposed for this cycle. I know last cycle some pretty significant changes were made for how the CSP discharges batteries, and then also the greenhouse gas emissions profile of system power. It went from something that was based on the actual greenhouse gas profile on an hourly basis to just assuming system power is entirely reflected of gas generation. Are any of those assumptions going to be reconsidered, or any other analytical assumptions in the CSP?
So I would say at this point that the last version of the CSP is the starting point for developing the new CSP. Although if you do have specific analytical changes, we're open to anything at this point. So feel free to send over a suggestion, specifically in regards to how batteries are dispatched or any other resource. The dispatch assumptions and production profiles and generation shapes are all based on Servum. So, but the outputs of Servum. So to the extent that how Servum, the representation of batteries and Servum changes, that'll flow into the CSP, but the CSP will continue to just take Servum outputs.
Thank you.
David, one more. Mark Specht.
Go, Mark.
Hey, thanks. This is Mark with UCF. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Just a real quick follow-up question on the CSP that we were just talking about. I know in the past, I think that has been informed by portfolios that came out of the reference system plan that were then modeled in Servum. So this time around, are you all using kind of last round's reference system plan or the preferred system plan to update CSP values? Just a clarifying question on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so the starting point for developing the templates and the CSP are the preferred system plan that was just adopted. So the adopted portfolio was a 38 million metric ton, but there was a 30 million metric ton sensitivity that was released along with the PSP. So those are the starting points, and we'll be making those sort of initial INA updates that Ali described, the near-term ones, such as updating to the 2021 IPR and updating the transmission constraints. We'll be making some of that routine maintenance INA updates, and then rerunning the PSP for CSP development.
Got it. Thank you.
We also have a question in the chat from Nick Pappas that I'll read out and try to answer. Will you be considering any standardized public reporting? Public IRP data is often PDF'd and redacted with differing approaches across LSEs. Some basic unifying quantitative data, which all LSEs must provide, would be very helpful for stakeholder engagement and review. Nick, tremendous. I always mix up empathy and sympathy here, but I think you get my drift. It also has large effects on staff working with it on our side of the confidentiality firewall, so to speak. We are basically constantly working, not just as IRP, but across the agency, including legal and others affected, to try to figure out better solutions here. But I'm not certain I can commit to doing anything super different for this coming set of filings, because it's basically bigger than IRP. But it's definitely something that we consider very important, and something that I think would help not just transparency, but efficiency of, for everybody. I hope that helps. And I think we're kind of right at time. Should we kick off the next section?
Oh, I just want to respond to something I saw in the Q&A. Again, that email address for submitting comments is irpdatarequest@cpuc.ca.gov. And it's on an earlier slide in this deck if you want to find that address.
And just quick housekeeping, I'll also say to Miriam, Doug, and Mark, you all still have hands up. I'm not certain if that's intentional. If you have a new question, something like that, maybe dump it in the Q&A and we can address it during this section.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Neil Raff, and on the outline slide, next slide, just orient this next meaty part of this webinar on reliability. So I'm just going to set some context on that, and then you'll hear from the rest of the team on the key considerations. And the main point I'm going to be making in setting this context is that there's a significant reliability effort across this IRP cycle through 2023. And then we've got this near-term use case to focus on today, which you'll be hearing a lot about. We're allowing about 20 minutes for questions on these topics, just for reference, so that should be fruitful. So starting with the goals of an IRP reliability framework here, clearly CAISO system reliability, putting that into 5 key design objectives, And actually, before going into that, just by framework, I'm really referring here to considerations of both planning and procurement, but noting that the focus of today is on planning, but we've got to keep procurement in mind as we develop this framework. So with that in mind, reliability, clearly key objective. Efficiency calls into the matter of cost, achieving reliability, doing so at least cost. Fairness is to do with each LSE's role in supporting reliability. The feasibility is making sure that what we do establish or continue to build on, we're not starting from scratch here, but what we do build on is administratively simple and straightforward to comply with. And then durability goes to the reliability need determination in particular, and a goal that determination, which is foundational to this topic, is durable as our portfolio changes over time, the resource mix changes. So we're seeing this as an IRP reliability framework. IRP process has the PU code requirements regarding reliability in the mid to long term. And we recognize that it does, though, touch on a number of other CPUC processes, as well as processes facilitated by other state agencies. So then on the next slide, taking those 5 goals, building on those, the context here is, like, we, among many jurisdictions worldwide now, are evolving reliability framework to the challenges of a decarbonizing grid. So building on those 5 goals, what does this mean for IRP reliability? Okay, again, emphasizing we've got to have alignment between the planning and the procurement part. And the nature of our IRP process, as distinct from others in other jurisdictions, has a significant involvement from LSE planning, big focus of today. And so the framework design needs to incorporate aggregation of LSE plans, individual plans, so that we have reliability at the system level. The third point here is calling out the significance of new resource investment. That's been a focus of IRP till now and should continue to be. And then the fourth point calls out that existing resources and retention of the appropriate types, amounts, and timing of existing resources is critical. This is a primary example of a unique need in IRP planning procurement. Regarding this challenge, I just point out that the midterm reliability decision last year and the preferred system plan decision in February this year both directed the IRP process towards designing a programmatic approach to procurement and regarding this challenge of existing resource retention. The next slide, opportunities to improve IRP reliability planning. Great reference here. You can see this webinar is building on past efforts of reliability planning in IRP, starting from 2017-18 cycle. So there's a brief history captured here on the left, and then the table provides a summary of how staff expects we can improve on that. And the team will be discussing these elements today, so that we can refer back to this. And so then on slide 23, with all that broad background on improving the reliability framework in IRP, I just want to focus on what the remainder of this webinar is about. So it's this near-term use case. Setting up the LSE templates is going to require modeling over the next 2 to 3 months and analysis to arrive at the values and other features of these templates that James has described. So for reliability, it'll be the planning reserve margin or some reliability standard for LSEs to be planning for. Think of also the resource counting in the LSE plans. It's the LCCs by resource type. So that's what the focus of the remainder of this webinar is about. We should keep the later use cases in mind of this type of thinking, meaning that later this cycle, we're going to be updating the IRP PRM, likely picking that up later this year and into next year. And then the program development, as required by the PSP decision in February. As you probably know, that decision calls out a Q2 workshop. So that's coming up soon. So I focused on the near-term use case, and I'm now going to turn to Donald Brooks, supervisor of our energy resource modeling team, to connect this effort to the related work that is going on across the energy division, not just in IRP. Over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Neil. So energy division's reliability modeling, broadly speaking, we're using this loss of load framework in a variety of commission proceedings in addition to IRP. Energy division completed, for example, a loss of load in the Elcc study in the RA proceeding to determine the Elcc, the average Elcc of wind, solar, storage, and hybrid resources, as well as a proposed PRM for the 2023 and 2024 RA compliance year, for example, and that's out, and that was sent out for party comment. Energy division is also using this loss of load framework as part of the no new DER portfolio for the avoided cost, to generate the avoided costs in the avoided cost calculator. I think I got this acronym right. It's Integrated Demand Energy Resource Proceeding, IDER, to establish avoided cost. The diverse applications of loss load modeling all rely on the same baseline data set, updated as detailed earlier with the INA updates and based on the preferred system plan. These diverse applications include electric demand, baseline resources, generation profiles for non-firm resources. It's critical to maintain the consistency and stability in these data sets to enable consistency between modeling done in all of these commission proceedings. All modeling data is going to be posted to the PUC website. There's the name of the page for parties to review and comment for this reliability, this 2022 process, and parties can review the data development during INA development and of course periodic MAG meetings like this one. I think this goes off to Aaron. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Donald. Good afternoon. This is Aaron Burdick from E3. I'll be presenting the next section, and just to orient folks to how we'll proceed here, we're going to start big picture about how reliability planning is changing. What are the elements of a durable and robust framework? Then Astrape will talk about applying that to need determination within the IRP, and we'll discuss then how to apply resource accreditation, and then move in more towards the actual near-term use case that Neil mentioned of the near-term LSE plans. So folks may have seen this curve before. This is a conceptual diagram that shows how the nature of reliability planning changes with the energy transition. So historically, when we had no renewable penetration on the system, the hour of reliability challenge that was the greatest was consistent with the hour of highest load. So in California, that's in the summer afternoon when we have the load peak in July or August. However, as renewables are added, the period of system stress moves away from the highest load hour to more moderate to high load hours with low renewables. So we see that in California, again, summer peaking system moving to later in the day to the net peak. And then in the longer term, this is the 2030 to 2045 challenge, we see the period of reliability stress shifting even not just later in the day, but out of the summer entirely, moving towards the winter when extended periods of low renewable production present the greatest threat to reliability. So these are renewable droughts, as we call them, multi-day low wind or solar events. Next slide, please. So we pulled some data from August 14th, 2020. This was, of course, the first day that summer when rotating outages were necessary by the CAISO to illustrate the fact that basically this shift has already happened in California. So I am showing 3 curves here, the gross, managed, and net peak. So I'll talk through what each of those mean. The gross peak is essentially the peak of end-use consumption. And this happened on this day around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The managed peak is the metered peak. In other words, this is the peak that the CAISO sees and dispatches towards. So it's after the behind the meter resources have reduced the gross peak. And then the net peak is after both the behind the meter resources and the supply side wind and solar resources. So you can see the managed peak shifts an hour later to about 4 p.m., but the net peak on this day was around 8 p.m. after the solar generation had dropped off. And it's that net peak, the hours of approximately 6 to 8 p.m. when the system experienced the greatest stress, and that's when the stage 3 emergency occurred. So we need to develop a planning approach that is going to be durable for this continued shift of the challenge of reliability stress as the energy transition rolls forward. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about what this framework might look like, starting again here from the sort of blue sky first principles basis, there are 4 key steps to reliability planning. The first is to determine a reliability standard. So the CPUC has adopted a 1 day in 10-year standard or a 0.1 days per year loss of load expectation. That's the standard that's been used in IRP thus far. And then step 2, from that standard, you can derive what is the total system resource need in order to maintain that probabilistic standard. And that can be converted into a reserve margin. Step 3, you need to know how to count different resource types towards that total system need. So that's, we term resource accreditation. And then step 4, there needs to be a design for the market to take that total need and counting of different resources and incorporate the economics to obtain a least cost solution. In California and the Southwest Power Pool, this is done through bilateral contracting. In the East Coast markets, it's through a centralized capacity auction. Next slide, please. So what is the most robust method for implementing those steps that we know will work through the energy transition? It's the use of an old tool, but an increasingly important one, loss of load probability modeling. And I wanted to outline the 3 key steps to set up an LLP framework that can address the needs of a reliability framework. So first off, you need to have a robust data set. LLP modeling is basically very large model simulations. So you need a long historical record of correlated load, weather, and renewable output so that you can simulate the system under a broad range of weather conditions. And this data set would also include detailed operational parameters and outage characteristics of all your resources. Step 2, again, is determining the total system need. And there is a well-established method for doing that using an LLP model. As Kevin will talk about, that is the common practice in the other RTO, RA programs across the country. So you have to simulate the system with different levels of resources so that you can draw out this black curve, draw out different points to build that curve, and then find where that curve intersects with your reliability standard. And that is the megawatts that will enable you to meet your reliability standard. And of course, that can be converted to a PRM as desired. Then step 3 is to accredit resources against that standard. And the capabilities of LOLP modeling enable what we call effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. And the basic steps of an ELCC calculation are shown on this conceptual schematic. And so you start the system at the reliability standard, in this case 0.1 days per year. You can add or remove a resource to that system, and then add or remove perfect capacity to determine, I should say, until you get back to the reliability standard to determine its ELCC. So I am going to hand it over now to Kevin Carden from Astrape to talk about need determination.
Thanks, Aaron. And you've already done a lot of the hard work for me. I will breeze through some of the concepts, as I think Aaron's introduction is probably sufficient for some of that. Go ahead and advance to the first slide. So as Aaron mentioned, one of the goals of loss of load probability modeling is to incorporate the various uncertainties that can drive the need for reserves. Obviously, we know with a load forecast, we can't carry exactly resources equal to that load forecast. We need some reserves to account for things like weather uncertainties. Load may be higher than expected due to hotter temperatures. We need to account for economic growth uncertainty. We need to account for generator performance uncertainty, and for regional market interactions, which are driven by the same factors, but it often makes sense to break that one out separately. So those 4 components kind of drive the need for reserves, in addition to obviously the need to carry operating reserves as well during extreme events. And that is all going to kind of drive toward the target reserve margin that we identify through this loss of load probability modeling. So these simulations entail thousands and thousands of draws through those various components that I just mentioned, identify what level of resources are needed in order to maintain a standard of 1 day in 10 years, 1 day with fewer than 1 day in 10 years of firm load shed. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. Sorry, back. Yep, there we go. The outputs of LLP modeling, obviously it's not just the loss of load expectation, the number of days with firm load shed. We also get other reliability metrics, expected unserved energy, kind of the volume of energy that was shed, loss of load probability, percentage of time that you shed firm load, loss of load hours, corollary to the loss of load probability, the number of hours per year. A lot of these metrics have kind of converged on the loss of load expectation because it is more or less a binary metric. Did you or did you not keep the lights on? I think it's a good way of looking at reliability, and it comports with the way that the market tends to look at reliability. To the extent you are able to meet all firm load obligations, then you're deemed sufficient. And if you don't, regardless of the size of those events, then you're not. There's debate obviously across that, but in general, the marketplace, the industry is converged around a 1 day in 10 loss of load expectation standard. From that 1 day in 10 standard, as Aaron mentioned, we can derive the total reliability need. From that, we can derive the planning reserve margin requirement. So divide that planning, or that total reliability need divided by the peak load forecast gives you the planning reserve requirement. With this modeling effort, we can identify the ELCC, as he illustrated as well. And we can identify kind of how short or long we are relative to that standard with this modeling. Next slide, please. I just went through this concept, I guess, a little bit in advance. Again, that PRM formula, the total reliability need divided by the peak demand minus 1. So if we get a 20% reserve margin, some of that's due to the load uncertainty, some of that's due to the economic growth uncertainty, some of that's due to the generator performance. We have to understand each of those components. But ultimately, this framework allows us to run the analysis to calculate that total reliability need. the total reliability need, we are trying to move toward a framework, and I'll get into this on subsequent slides, of measuring everything in terms of effective capacity, putting every resource category on a comparable basis. So when we talk about 100 megawatts of effective capacity, that's fungible across all resource categories and types. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide and discuss that in a little more detail. So the ways that we differentiate this. So historically, reserve margins have been expressed in terms of installed capacity. When a system was comprised entirely of dispatchable resources, whose only discount to kind of effective capacity was their forced outage rate, it generally made sense to measure the planning reserve margin in terms of the installed capacity over the load forecast. As systems have evolved and we've begun to add a more energy limited or non-dispatchable capacity, that framework, that paradigm doesn't work quite so well. So we have to introduce some additional concepts. One that we've borrowed from, one that we use for conventional capacity that has a forced outage rate to measure that effective capacity, is this unforced capacity label. Unforced capacity is measuring the resources contribution using their unforced capacity. So we've subtracted out the equivalent forced outage rate during demand periods. So a generator, 500 megawatt generator with a 5% E4D would be given 475 megawatts of unforced capacity rating. Now that's not exactly equal to a perfect capacity rating, because we recognize that the contribution to reliability is not exactly equal to its average availability. We can't simply take 1 minus the E4D and measure its relative contribution to reliability, because during those reliability events, we may have correlated outages, we may have other effects that mean that resource's contribution is less. I like to reference this. The example that I tend to give is in a classroom setting. If I want to understand the class average value, if I look at the average of across all testing periods, I may get one rating, but if I want to understand their contribution during extreme events, I would give it a different rating. So in the context of system planning, if I look at reliability events, I'm generally going to have much more outages than normal during those extreme events. And so the UCAP may not be a great proxy for that resource's reliability value. Non-firm resource accreditation, we've taken this concept and applied it historically with the use of Elcc. Elcc is attempting to fully account for that reliability contribution, recognizing during those extreme events, the 1 day and 10-year type event, what contribution are we getting from those resource classes? So that Elcc concept is more equatable to a perfect capacity accounting. So that's what we're attempting to do with conventional resources as well, get every resource class on the same basis. Next slide. Okay, so installed capacity, if I look at the megawatts required to meet a reliability standard, if I'm substituting non-firm resources for firm resources, so I'm moving from a conventional system, a predominantly conventional system, to one that has a heavier share of non-firm resources like batteries or wind or solar, you would actually expect the reliability standard to decline. The PRM requirement would decline because those non-firm resources are given just their kind of effective capacity rating. So it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive to the concept that, hey, as we add renewable, we need to carry more reserves. Well, if you do your accounting correctly, then that actually should not be the case, because with proper accounting, those resources, we're calculating exactly what their effective capacity is. And so the reserve margin would actually decline. That's actually not ideal, though. We'd love for all resource classes to be on the same basis, again, to have fungible capacity and maintain a constant or static reserve margin requirement. And the way that we would do that, one option is to use UCAP, this unforced capacity concept, where if I replace, instead of giving that 500 megawatt generator, I put in its 475 megawatt UCAP value. That's going to give me a bit more stable of a reserve margin requirement, because as I swap out that capacity, I'm doing it on a more comparable basis now. And so the reserve margin wouldn't change as much. Again, we still have this issue that UCAP doesn't equal perfect capacity, because during those extreme events, we're probably not going to get the average forced outage rate of the system. We're going to have higher than normal outages from all the generators. Those coincident outages are going to drive reliability events, so we have to take into account some difference. We just released a public study last week that looks into this in detail. We do think that it can be material. So a system that has a 5% forced outage rate, it may have a PCAP adjustment that's several percentage points higher than that. So that will be something that we'll be looking at in this cycle. Next slide. So we talked about the design objectives, trying to maintain reliability, obviously, efficiency, fairness, feasibility, durability. I mentioned maintaining a static reserve margin, having this comparable framework across all resource classes would help us to meet those design objectives. So in this table above, showing that perfect capacity accomplishes all of those objectives. The unforced capacity may get us close. We'll be doing research during the cycle to understand kind of the difference between that perfect capacity and unforced capacity with respect to kind of how well that serves as a proxy in terms of kind of comparing other regions that are looking at these paradigms. MISO, New York, PJM, they're all using a combination of ICAP and UCAP metrics to identify reliability targets and so forth. We do think there's a general consensus to move toward a more level playing field by using some type of either UCAP or PCAP methodology. Next slide. So how to switch from an Icap PRM. So obviously if we do the analysis with Icap capacities, we're going to get this large number. If I remove all that capacity and put back in perfect capacity, I can see that in the third bar here in this chart that my reserve margin requirement is going to go down. The difference between my Icap reserve margin and this perfect capacity reserve margin will be isolated to that generator performance impact. The only variability that I have now in my analysis is the load uncertainty and the need to carry operating reserves. So the difference there, that generator performance impact, is going to be what we can attribute to or account for those resources, their imperfect performance. If I just looked at their E4D accounting, so that system with a 5% E4D, it would suggest that the impact of forced outages is smaller, but because of those kind of high impact events, the reliability events, see that it's larger. So we need to account for that difference in the UCAP and the PCAP with some further adjustment. And we'll be exploring some different methods through this process. Next slide. So to summarize kind of the proposed method that we intend to use for this work, we'll start with the 2030 CAISO portfolio. We intend to look at the reserve margin requirement from a perfect capacity standpoint. So we'll remove all capacity, identify how much perfect capacity we need to meet the model load variability. So that PRM will kind of identify with perfect capacity, this is the reserve margin obligation. And then we do the accounting for all resource classes. We need to take into account that comparison between the resources' actual attributes, the duration limits on batteries, the non-dispatchability of wind and solar, and the forced outage rate impacts of the conventional fleet to keep all those on a comparable basis. And then obviously there's a lot of work to do in terms of the accounting or accreditation of those resources to make sure that we've done that accounting correctly. I think that's the end of my section.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Maybe we could pause here and just reassess regarding a couple questions. Marion McCoon, still thinking of you. If your question hasn't been answered yet, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. Once we got to ICAP and UCAP, I figured maybe we entered the territory of what you were trying to tackle before. And then just a couple notes for our panelists like Aaron and Kevin, when you guys get a moment. A few of the questions have been dumped in your Q&A queue about stuff that you just covered. I do see Doug Carper with a hand up.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. I guess I had sort of a question about the like thermal derates and correlations of outages with high load conditions. I know the CAISO has proposed at least one UCAP measure that would capture that by limiting, like by focusing on the outages during the highest 20, I think it was 20% of load hours, which I guess wouldn't really be super relevant here since that's not what you're proposing to do. But I guess my question is, when assessing the, running the models to assess the firm portfolio ELCC, that includes the correlation of outages with load, right? Basically from high temperatures and thermal derates when you're running those models, or are those like random and independent of temperature and load?
Yep. So we have not historically incorporated higher outages as a function of temperature. There may be some ambient derates that we've incorporated or that we'll incorporate. On the high temperature side, we don't see as much correlation on that, but I do think it's something worth looking into. Obviously, another jurisdiction, we look at cold temperature, that's more of an issue. I do think, though, the key effect, the fact that outages, we see higher outages during reliability events means that those outages are actually driving the reliability events. So even if you're not putting in a specific or explicit correlation between outages, there's still this effect. So if I filter for reliability events in the output of the model, I'm going to see that my outages during that period is significantly higher than my outages during a standard high load hour. So from that perspective, we need to kind of respect or capture that effect in our accounting as well. So it's already taken into account in our planning reserve margin determination. It's been done for years, but we haven't tried to account for that in the accounting side. I'll mention, you mentioned maybe taking the top 20% hours. We've had other jurisdictions that have suggested maybe the top 100 hours in a year or 20 hours in a year to look at the reference for how these units perform. Ultimately, though, that's still not a great proxy for reliability contribution because we're looking at 1 day in 10 type reliability. So the top 20 hours a year is still going to give me a disconnect between my reserve margin determination and the value that these resources bring. So you have to be even more rigorous in terms of your kind of filter for how you look at a resource's contribution to reliability. So from that perspective, I think a lot of these proxies are heuristics that are used to identify the value. It'd be like going back to well, what's the average wind output in the afternoon and what's the average solar output in the afternoon? It's not a great proxy for reliability contribution. So it really needs to be derived from the simulations.
Yeah. No, that all sounds right. No, that sounds like a great step forward. I like the sound of this. So thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Doug. Mark Specht has a hand up too.
Yeah, thanks. This is Mark with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Just a quick follow-up question on this slide we're looking at right now, slide 37. I'm just trying to understand for which things you're proposing to calculate ELCC values. So it looks like you'd be calculating an ELCC value for the entire portfolio of resources, including everything, and then also ELCC values for just like renewables and storage is what I'm interpreting on the right there. So is that right? You wouldn't be trying to assign ELCC values to specific technologies or to thermal resources or anything like that?
Ultimately, we do have to do that assignment to all resource classes, and I think Jimmy's going to be speaking of that later. Aaron, should we hold that question till later?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I'll just say, so we are planning to take the ELCC approach for non-firm resources. So that requires setting them as a portfolio and then potentially thinking about how to allocate that portfolio. What's shown here is an adjustment to the UCAP value for firm resources. So that is not measuring them within a portfolio ELCC and then allocating to those resources. It's essentially removing the non-firm portfolio the non-firm portfolio is in, but we are understanding how those resources interact, and like Kevin said, basically have to adjust this UCAP D rate to account for those interactive effects. So that's a new and I would suggest somewhat innovative way of dealing with this, but it doesn't go all the way to an ELCC study of all resource types, which would require a bunch more ELCC runs for 6 to 8 additional resource classes.
And then Matthew Barmack also has his hand up. Thanks, Mark.
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, hey, this is Matt Barmack with Calpine. And I'm just trying to understand what Kevin just said and in response to Doug. But what I'm hearing, and maybe Jimmy's going to cover this later, but what I'm hearing is you're not actually trying to model explicitly ambient D rates or the correlations between outages and weather or outages and load, but you're just sort of capturing, sort of the fact that randomly, statistically, you'll get sort of a bad draw and you'll have a bunch of outages occur at the same time, and that tends to drive reliability events. Anyway, that's sort of a question, substantive question, but related to that, just from a process standpoint, I'm hoping that if you're going to do a lot more kind of sophisticated LLE modeling of thermal generation that involves assumptions about correlations between outages and weather and load, that you'll give parties a chance to weigh in on those assumptions. I'll stop there. I had one other question.
Yeah, Matt, on that last
feedback.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, good feedback, Matt. I'll just say, if you think about kind of from conceptual standpoint, a system with a 5% E4, if we knew that every hour we were going to have 5% of the system offline, then we could carry 5% reserves for it. If I look at actual data, historical data, the variation goes from 0% of the system offline up to 12 or 13% of the system offline. So we need to carry reserves for something higher than 5%, but less than 12 or 13%. We need to do the simulations to identify exactly what that threshold is. Maybe it's 7 or 8%. Ultimately, that's kind of what we're looking for in the analysis.
And when I've heard you describe this issue before, that can happen even if just randomly, even if outages aren't driven by weather, correct?
That's exactly right. So that distribution is based on completely independent or random outages.
Okay. Well, I look forward to hearing more about this. I had one other, very, very open-ended question, and maybe this is for you, Nathan, and maybe you want to put this in the parking lot. But given so right now, the RA structure, it's not exactly what you're describing here, but it's based on sort of a broadly similar framework. But a very different framework, the slice of day framework, is being contemplated, and I'm just wondering, how you see this flanging up with that. Maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe it shouldn't. But if you have any thoughts about that, I'd be grateful to hear them.
Matt, it's a good point. And Neil, I don't know if we have any process type slides coming near the back where we could tee up that kind of question. But if not, we can just try to address it now just qualitatively. Because Matt, I think you're right. I don't think we could provide any technical guidance on if and how you'd connect the two right now. It's more just something, like you said, parking lot, but like big parking lot of how will the methods and tools we use interface with those used in RA. It's definitely not lost upon us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I would just sort of put that in the bucket of very much procurement type aspects of the reliability framework here. Today, we're more focusing on planning. Of course, the two are very intertwined, but we're not.
Just one quick observation, kind of
the procurement implications.
Sorry, Neil.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick observation with respect to a comment that Aaron made earlier, just recognizing that, you know, the shift in reliability planning, shifting the time of events, the season of events, et cetera. I think in the context of an energy limited system, it's hard to kind of prescribe exactly when you have that need. I think the planning reserve margin is a function of the gross system peak load, with ELCCs still fully accounts for kind of all the variation, the timing, the daily timing, the seasonal timing of every resource class. So I think that's kind of the framework that we have at least presented here, is not trying to isolate the timing. So the accounting is still based on that annual peak load concept, recognizing we can maintain that relatively static reserve margin requirement as long as we're doing our ELCC accounting correctly. Then we're going to pick up those shifts in the timing of those events. But just from a big picture planning standpoint.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think just quick housekeeping, kind of at the end of this Q&A section, I'm going to counter some of the direction I gave participants back in our intro slides to please raise your hand. Since we're a little bit behind on time, I'm going to ask folks that have questions for future sections to actually use the Q&A function and type your question to us. We can actually deal with it kind of in parallel to the presentation, and it sometimes presents some time savings. But otherwise, let's get back on track.
Okay, thanks, Aaron Burdick again from E3. I'll be taking this next section. So we've already talked a bit about resource accreditation, but wanted to just lay out some of the concepts as to how ELCCs actually get used. So to start with, like people, no energy resource is perfect. However, we can consider them on a spectrum of resource firmness, as we've laid out here. So you have variable energy resources that are subject to weather. Then you have use or energy limited resources that can be dispatched when you want them to, but they are subject to physical, environmental, or contractual limitations. And then there is firm capacity resources that are available on demand when you want them to run, but they are still subject to forced outages and fuel security. So we have on the far right this idea of a perfect capacity resource. This is the resource unicorn, if you will, that doesn't actually exist, but is useful as a comparison metric. So if we can create a methodology that can compare all of the resources to the left to a perfect capacity resource that has no use limitations and can operate whenever called upon, we can create this sort of level playing field that we've been talking about. Next slide, please. So yeah, Kevin already covered a bit of this in the need determination section, but just want to make sure folks follow that the need determination approach and the resource accreditation approach are intrinsically linked. And so they need to evolve together. Yeah, as Kevin mentioned, so in this traditional paradigm where we're just calculating the installed capacity against an Icap requirement, all you have to do is sum the nameplate of the firm generators on your system to understand how reliable your system is, how much reliable megawatts you have. But as we move increasingly towards portfolios of more non-firm resources, so the variable and energy limited resources, the total reliable capacity of that portfolio actually becomes a function of generator interactions, not just a sum of their capacity. So we need a methodology that can properly calculate the total reliable capacity of that portfolio. And then there is benefit to taking the firm generators and putting them on an apples to apples basis using effective capacity, either through Elcc or UCAP. And doing so might actually reduce the overall requirement, resource requirement. So a lower PCAP PRM versus an Icap PRM, again, for the same level of reliability. And just wanted to reiterate sort of the two primary benefits of moving to this level playing field. So the first is that you have a more durable definition of need that's less susceptible to change as the portfolio shifts around over time. So, we set this 15% reserve margin, 15 or so years ago, and that's been maintained, but I think per the sort of discussions that came out of the August events, I think there's not much controversy to say that that 15% is no longer sufficient because of the evolving resource portfolio. So we think there's a benefit to continuously updating a PRM, but that if we move to this approach, there's going to be less change over time as the portfolio changes. Then the second benefit of a level playing field is to create a more economically efficient market. As Kevin mentioned, all resources become fungible, essentially substitutes for one another from a reliability perspective. Next slide, please. So what are some of the resource interactions in the California system that we care about? So on the left here, we can see adding solar to a sort of toy system, and that shifts the net peak into the evening with an effect of diminishing returns as the net load moves into the non-solar hours. If we take that same system and just add batteries without solar in the middle here, you can see that there's a diminishing return from additional batteries. As you flatten and extend that net peak, you require longer duration batteries to provide the same level of net peak reduction. But if we add both of those resources together, there are interactive effects whereby the whole may exceed the sum of its parts. So in this case, we have solar narrowing the net peak, which is a benefit for storage. Solar also provides charging energy for the storage, and the storage helps to push the net peak back into the hours of solar output. So the Elcc method, through simulating overall weather conditions, both of these resources inherently captures the capacity and energy adequacy across all the hours of those simulated years. Next slide, please. So what are the Elcc calculations that we do? So to start off with this chart on the right, you can imagine an individual resource having a convex curve as you add more of it, representing its diminishing return of capacity. And if you measure the height of that curve, you'll know the Elcc of all of the installed capacity of that single resource. And if you take the slope, or for math nerds, the partial derivative of that curve, you can get the marginal Elcc at any point along the way. Now, if you want to consider a portfolio of resources in the same way, it requires a bit more imagination. So instead of this curve, you have to consider a multi-dimensional surface. where each of the dimensions is a different resource or a different resource class. And the height of that surface will be the portfolio ELCC, which will be a function of the penetration of multiple generators. So you can think a portfolio of solar, wind, and energy storage, having solar, wind, and energy storage dimensions. And then you can measure the marginal ELCC at that point on the surface. In other words, at that portfolio of those resources by adding 100 megawatts of solar, adding 100 megawatts of storage, or adding 100 megawatts of solar and storage together. You can use these marginal ELCC calculations to map out the surface, even though you can't necessarily mathematically know the entire surface because it's complex and nonlinear and the like. So portfolio ELCC and marginal ELCC calculations are those that are calculated rigorously, coming directly out of LLP modeling. So this concept of an average ELCC requires essentially determining how to allocate the portfolio value amongst individual resources. And in a sense, it's inherently subject to trade-offs in the same way that when we do electricity rate design, determining how to allocate costs among different customer classes is subject to trade-offs. So next slide, please. So the delta method is one method to do this allocation that E3 came up with a couple of years ago that we think correctly balances some of these competing objectives to be used in an average accreditation framework. So the delta method requires 3 measurable metrics. So there's the portfolio ELCC, the height of the surface. There is the first in marginal ELCC, which is without other non-firm resources on the system, what's the first increment of, let's say, solar worth. Then there's the last in marginal ELCC, which is with all of the other non-firm resources on the system, what's the next increment of solar worth. And the delta method, when applied, ensures that each resource receives an ELCC that's between its first in and last in value, and that resources who exhibit diminishing returns, basically as we've shown on the chart to the right here, would have an upward adjustment to their last in ELCC, and resources that don't have interactive effects within the portfolio, in other words, their first in and last in ELCCs are the same, would not require any adjustment. So this method can account for both synergistic, meaning the solar and storage example, antagonistic, which would be storage and demand response, as well as neutral interactions within a single portfolio. Next slide, please. Okay, so in thinking about the use of average versus marginal ELCCs for LSE planning, now moving kind of directly to the near-term use case, we can understand that whether an average or a marginal ELCC for different resources is provided will change the relative cost effectiveness for each unit of effective capacity that resources are providing. So there's an illustrative table on this slide where you can see, just with some kind of dummy numbers here, how the relative ranking of these 4 resources from a dollar per effective kilowatt year perspective may change in using average versus marginal. And average ELCCs, folks are familiar with. That's what the RA program currently uses. It's relatively intuitive in the sense that it's compatible with a conventional PRM, and that if you add up all of your average ELCCs, you will get the total system need. Marginal ELCCs have been used for valuing incremental capacity additions in the past. That's because they provide a more precise and economically efficient signal for, you could say, a level playing field for the reliability value of the next increment of additions. Hence, they were used in the MTR order and in RPS valuation within the CPUC. However, if one is to establish the total need, or the need based on using marginal ELCC accreditation for all resources, then the marginal procurement need may be less than the total, and there are some adjustments that are needed accordingly. So a marginal ELCC approach would establish a marginal procurement need and credit resources based on their contribution against that need. So that is akin to measuring their contribution during the net peak hours as that net peak changes over time. I'll just say this is a live topic in the RA programs across the country. So PJM has adopted a Delta method-based average ELCC accreditation framework, while the New York ISO is pursuing a marginal ELCC methodology. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the inputs that are required for LSEs to do reliability planning? Next slide. So in its simplest, there's really only two inputs. There's the requirement. So as an LSE, what is your megawatt obligation in each year between now and the end of the planning horizon, so 2035 for this IRP cycle. And then there is the set of accreditation metrics for how different resources in each year count towards that total megawatt obligation. Next slide. So how do we go from the total reliability need of the system to the reliability need for each LSE? Well, there is an existing method to do that in the RA program. Basically, it takes the managed peak load share of each LSE to allocate the managed peak load of the CAISO to set the forward RA obligations. And IRP can follow a similar approach. However, we may consider some minor adjustments. So instead of just looking at the year ahead LSE peak share, we would prefer to have a longer term forecast of how the LSE peak share changes over time, including planned levels of load shift between LSEs. So the IRP staff are talking to the CEC about producing a longer term LSE peak share forecast. And then if we are to count behind the meter PV as a supply resource in IRP accounting, which would be consistent with counting all resources at their effective capacity, then we may consider the gross peak share instead of the managed peak share. So that's a question that we're exploring as well. And marginal ELCC-based framework, as I mentioned, would require some further adjustments to LSE need. And one can ask whether in the long run, as the period of reliability stress moves further away from the gross peak and even the metered or managed peak, whether considering allocating needs based on the net peak share of each LSE, whether that might at some point become a more optimal approach. Next slide. So this slide summarizes in this table the planned approach for providing the reliability requirement and accreditation metrics to LSEs for their planning. So we would provide a Pcap Prm, which would be over the gross peak. And if a marginal ELCC approach is pursued, that would require providing marginal procurement need for each LSE. And firm resources would get the UCAP with adjustments. So we're calling that for now calibrated UCAP values. And then the non-firm resources would have a forecast of ELCCs. So we're designing an ELCC study that would look at a subset of the planning years using the latest preferred system plan to run maybe 6 or 7 years, an ELCC study for a set of resource classes shown here. So 2 classes of solar, 3 of wind, 3 of storage, 1 of demand response, with hybrids getting a heuristic as we did for MTR. And then from that ELCC study, we would be able to do some interpolation and some ex post adjustments that could allow us to produce an annual ELCC forecast for LSE planning. A couple more things to note before I hand it over to Jimmy to talk about resolve updates. So this ELCC study will be done twice, once for the 38 MMT portfolio and once for the 30 MMT portfolio. So that will result in 2 sets of ELCC forecasts. And also there's a couple TBDs on here that we're still sorting through. So behind the meter storage, we will either model in the ELCC study, or we can model it as a load modifier per the operating assumptions that are in the CEC IPR forecast. That's something we're exploring. And then pumped hydro storage, we are tentatively planning to consider it via ELCC, but also looking at calibrated UCAP as an option. And with that, I will hand it over to Jimmy.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Hello, everyone. Jimmy Nelson from E3. So I'm going to walk you through proposed updates to how resources will contribute to reliability requirements in Resolve. Next slide. So I guess first a problem statement, which is that to create a reliable least cost portfolio, capacity expansion model needs to know how much each resource is contributing to the planning reserve margin, or the the reliability constraint. And I think traditionally, when you had a lot of kind of firm dispatchable resources, that wasn't such a challenging issue. But the problem is in this era where we have a lot of wind and solar and storage that is going to contribute to the future resource mix. It becomes a lot more challenging to determine that capacity contribution for each resource, in part because all of the resources affect each other's capacity contribution. And so it's there's these interactive effects that are challenging to model. And as much as we might want to, it's not feasible or possible to embed a model like SERVM, a loss of load model, inside a capacity expansion model. And so you have to make some amount of approximation to try and get the most important effects that are happening in terms of resource capacity value, while not getting stuck in kind of an infinite loop between a loss of load model and a capacity expansion model. We think the ELCC surface concept that we have used in previous IRPs and proposed to update here is a way to help out. Next slide. So this is maybe the most important, or the summary slide of this whole section, which is going through on a resource class basis, which are on the left, how we have represented those in Resolve in the past and how we propose to represent them in the future. So any difference between the current IRP approach column and the proposed 2022 approach column represents a proposed change in how the resources capacity contribution is modeled. And maybe even before we get into the resources, I think building on the discussion of PCAP in the previous presentations, the plan is to shift resolves planning reserve margin over to a PCAP formulation instead of an Icap, which it has been before. And then to do that, you also need to, at the same time, shift how you count the firm resources. So the bottom 3 rows here, the hydro and the other kind of 0 GHG clean resources, and also the gas capacity has been previously represented as installed capacity, or really the NQC value from CAISO. So the proposal is to move it over to a calibrated UCAP, which is kind of a stand-in for a PCAP value for those resource contributions. Then the other big change is to move around how the solar and wind and storage are represented in Resolve. And I think the reason for this change is, in part just a reflection of the changing state of play and the change in the industry in the past few years. We designed Resolve a while back with a solar and wind capacity value surface, which I'll go into more later, because there's a decently strong interplay between the solar and wind capacity value. The more solar you had, the more the peak got put into the early evening, and then the wind would have more capacity value as a result. Well, that dynamic, I think, has mostly played itself out because there's so much solar now, and even more in the future, that maybe you don't need to model those two resources as kind of interdependent capacity contributions, but instead, the more important thing we think to model is the interdependency between solar and batteries. So Aaron showed a nice picture of that, where the sum of the capacity contributions of solar and batteries can be more than their parts. In other words, if you simulated the storage independently, the solar independently, and added the capacity contributions together, versus if you simulated them together, you would get a different value, and the together one gives you a higher capacity value. So we propose to move to a solar storage surface, and then move wind off to kind of a single dimensional curve. So, and all of this will require a number of SURVEM runs to trace out the reliability value of these resources. So it's all kind of based on SURVEM runs. Next slide. So I'll spend the remaining couple of slides that I have here going through this ELCC curve or surface idea that we've implemented in capacity expansion. I'd say one of the biggest motivating factors is capacity expansion models have traditionally had a really challenging time dealing with the saturation impact of resource capacity. So it's the most apparent with solar, where you add solar and your net peak starts to shift into the early evening, and where solar can't really contribute anymore. And so you see a declining marginal ELCC as you add more solar resources and keep the rest of the system constant. So that's maybe the biggest reason to have an ELCC curve in a capacity expansion model, because you're exploring different megawatt capacities, and you want to have the model pick the right amount of megawatts, and so you need to know the right marginal megawatt or marginal ELCC at different levels of resource penetration. But I want to make it clear that we are going to use the results of a loss of load model, SURVEM in this case, to populate Resolve's reliability contribution for solar and wind and storage, so that you have all of the complicated dynamics in that loss of load model built into your capacity contribution. So you have, for wind and solar, SURVEM is going to simulate across multiple weather years and all of the generator outage draws. All of those type of impacts are quantified in basically just the total portfolio ELCC of different amounts of wind and solar. So you take a complicated dynamic and boil it down to just the total ELCC of a certain set of resources. And then, for storage, you also take into account the charging and discharging behavior. So charging sufficiency, I know that's a worry to make sure your batteries have enough energy so that they can discharge, and that'll be taken into account via the loss of load model. And terminology, I'll refer to a one-dimensional ELCC curve, which is just a curve that depends only on the resource capacity of one type of resource. So in other words, just the proposal is just, for example, for wind's capacity value to only depend on the wind penetration in the system, except for the fact that that capacity value is determined by the loss of load model that has the entire CAISO system in it. But in Resolve, wind's capacity value would only depend on the amount of wind. And then there's also this two-dimensional ELCC surface, which is the extension of that to include interdependent impacts between resource classes. Next slide. So I'm just going to provide kind of a base summary of ELCC curves and surfaces in hopes to get folks up to speed. I think we presented some of this a few years back, but it's been a while now. So as I said before, the first thing you do is you simulate different combination or different installed capacities of the resource in question. Let's say it's wind here. So you trace out a curve with 0 megawatts of wind and 4 gigawatts and 10 gigawatts and 15 gigawatts, whatever you think might be explored by the capacity expansion model. And then you connect those different total portfolio ELCC values for the wind that you've added. You connect them with linear equations and put those linear equations into a capacity expansion model here, Resolve. That capacity expansion model creates least cost portfolios, knowing both the total ELCC and the marginal ELCC of the resource in question, wind, in this example. And then at the end, you want to make sure your system is reliable, so you do a reliability check. Next slide. So just giving pictures to the first 3 points of the previous slide. So the resource capacity on the x-axis, again, you can imagine that as the megawatts of wind on the system. So the real kind of true ELCC curve, you could imagine if you did an infinite number of loss of load model runs, you would trace out that curve on the left. You don't want to do an infinite number of runs, and so you do enough points to kind of fill out the general shape of the curve in the loss of load model. And you'll see that general behavior where as you add more resources, the total ELCC goes up, but the marginal ELCC goes down. Then in the middle, you connect those points that you simulated into lines, which then become linear equations in your capacity expansion model. And on the right, you can see basically what the capacity expansion model sees, or the surface, or the curve that it travels along is that bottom right curve with says portfolio ELCC. So that's the portfolio ELCC that Resolve would see for different amounts of resources. And then on kind of the upper right, it's still making investment decisions based on the marginal, which is this stair-step function that corresponds to the different slopes between the points. Next slide. So I think, this one's a little bit more challenging. I think the one-dimensional picture that I showed on the previous slide is relatively intuitive, but we think it's important to extend that concept into another dimension, in other words, another resource class, to be able to model interactive effects between solar and batteries, because they can have significant amounts of capacity values, interactive effects. So, so you can see here you've got 2 different types of resources on 2 different axes here, the solar and the batteries. And then the proposal is to do a number of survey simulations represented by the orange dots. And then what you do with those simulations is instead of making lines between them, you add a dimension, and now you're making equations for planes, which are then relatively straightforward to implement in a capacity expansion model. And all the equations of the planes together make this kind of quilt of basically marginal capacity values of battery and solar, or you can think of it as partial derivatives of solar and battery in different directions. So that's all I've got here. I think I'm passing it to Donald, I believe.
Thanks, Jimmy. And this is Nathan. Let's actually pause to try to tackle a couple of the open questions in the Q&A. There's only a few. Let me see here. So Sarah Mata asked almost an hour ago, sorry, Sarah, does the LOLP modeling need determination take into account future weather changes due to climate change, or does it use historic weather patterns as a proxy for future weather? Kevin, can you handle this one?
Happy to, Nathan. Thanks, Sarah. Great question. So the load forecast that our team uses is from IRP forecasts, and it does include or does consider climate change. To be honest, I'm not entirely clear on exactly the components or how that's done, but there is a trend, there's a climate change trend embedded in the load forecast. So the distribution of load scenarios that we use is scaled to reflect that climate change impact. There's a second component, though, the variation due to climate change, which is harder to quantify. So we continue to use the variability inherent in historical weather patterns as a proxy for the future weather variability. So what's the range of weather uncertainty? So we've scaled the trend up to the climate change impact, but could we have 10% variation or could we have 6% variation? We're still using history as a guide for that component of the climate change.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Maybe for Aaron, this next one from Matthew Kawatani, does slide 37 indicate the 2022 IRP Prm plus Elcc study will focus on 2030, or will other years be studied as well?
Okay, so we are planning to focus the PRM calculation on, at minimum, the year 2030. We may or may not have time to explore other years, but the ELCC study will be done, as I mentioned, at various points along the planning horizon so that we are properly tracking how the ELCCs of different resources are changing over time and providing that information to LSEs for their planning.
Thanks for that, Aaron. Maybe another one back to Kevin from Matthew Barmack. If ELCC values are not estimated for firm resources, will firm resource counting reflect synergies between firm resources and ELCC resources, e.g. the fact that gas can charge storage? Could calibrated UCAP reflect such synergies?
Yep, that one's a little bit more challenging. So I will say that yes, I think the answer should be yes, that it should reflect any kind of synergy between those resource classes. Ultimately, when we move to an energy constrained environment, what happens off peak matters for reliability. It's the same kind of reason that a solar resource, even though all reliability events happen after the peak, could still have positive ELCC values. Their ability to keep the batteries charged could contribute to their reliability value. In the same way now, a conventional resource that is charging those batteries, its forced outage rate during that period now will matter more. And so we may move from this kind of outage driven reliability event where it's not really your E4D to this energy constrained world where it really does matter kind of your average contribution now, making sure that you're able to run throughout the day. And so we would expect that effect to get picked up in this calibrated UCAP. I don't know that we'll quantify these specific individual effects, but ultimately I would expect those synergies to get reflected in the overall value.
Thanks, Kevin. Next one from Miriam just a couple minutes ago. Neil, I don't know if we're already working on this or maybe if we need a couple more minutes regarding RDD data entry questions.
Yeah, I noted that. Thanks, Miriam. Let's just take a couple more minutes and we'll either verbally or cover that written. Thanks.
And similarly, Andrew Mills just put one in, I think directed towards Jimmy for solar plus storage ELCC services. Jimmy, if we need a minute or two, just let me know.
I'm happy to answer it now. Yeah, so we're in discussion on, so should I repeat Andrew's question? Okay, yeah, I'll repeat it. How do you need to define a separate solar plus storage ELCC surface for different durations of storage? It's not obvious whether the storage ELCC changes more due to changes in the battery power rating or the energy rating. when you assume a fixed duration of storage, i.e. 4 hours, those two move together. But for planning purposes, we will want to know if the change in ELCC is different with 4-hour storage versus 8-hour storage. In other words, do you need a 3-dimensional ELCC surface for storage? I can definitely say that we've been in discussion about this topic, and I think the 3-dimensional surface would maybe be the ideal end state to try and trace out both the power and the energy rating. But we're not, you know, the issue with adding another dimension is that you need just a huge amount more runs of SERVM, the loss of load model runs. So we're exploring ways to, kind of maybe minimize the number of those runs and still capture the additional dimension question.
Jimmy, I'll just add, so conceptually talking about that simplification, in a world where reliability is strictly defined by energy constraints, so energy is kind of the binding constraint on reliability, then you would expect that all megawatt hours of storage are fungible from a reliability contribution perspective. So a 4-hour battery would be equal to exactly half of an 8-hour battery. Ultimately, we're going to try to use some of those heuristics and building ways to kind of simplify the problem statement as we kind of build it out. But ultimately, we do recognize that it is multidimensional.
And Andrew, it's a good question. What you're hearing is kind of a common theme from IRP of, we always have to look at the problem and see where we have to make trade-offs. And if this is a trade-off for time and resources versus getting to an ideal state, then we're totally open to ideas on, other thinking on how to approach the problem. Don't see, oh, actually there is a hand up from Jim Himelek. David, could we unmute?
Go ahead, Jim. Jim, you're unmuted.
Looks like he's muted again.
Yeah. Try it now. Nope, you keep muting yourself.
Jim, if you want to put your question in the Q&A and we can get to it before we adjourn. So I think that's it for this Q&A section. Am I passing to Donald here?
Yep. Yes, you are. So please move the slide deck forward. So the summary of the proposed approach is using the PUC SERVM model with any appropriate updates such as described earlier related to the 2021 IPR and adding 18 to 20 weather years as a basis for need determination and resource accreditation. System need is calculated via a perfect capacity based method where we translate that into a planning reserve margin above median gross peak. LSE level need based on the share of either the total reliability need or a marginal reliability need using new multi-year CEC LSE level forecast. This is an annual study, not a monthly study. So we're not going to be translating, we're not going to be creating, a month-specific total reliability need, and we're not going to translate into LSE specific needs 1 month at a time. It's an annual based study. LSE plan, the resource accreditations. We've talked about the difference between the firm and the non-firm resources. Non-firm resources use a ELCC-based methodology deriving straight from a study. The firm resources are get their accreditation from a derived calibrated UCAP value. You can see the resolve updates there are seeking to align the PRM and firm resource accreditation with the LSE plan approach. And we're, of course, making all the updates to resolve that come from the ELCC studies that we're performing here. there's a separate one-dimensional wind ELCC curve that is separate from the solar and the storage ELCC surface. I think that's, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin or Aaron, but I think that's because of the more interaction, greater interaction between solar and storage, and the less direct interaction between that and the wind. Move ahead to the next slide. The summary of this approach. You see the first column there is the current IRP approach, results of what we arrived at the end of last year. The proposed 2022 IRP approach collapses some of the battery, solar, and BPM PV storage ELCC individual studies into a combined surface study, and that's for the resolve updates. And then the 2022 IRP approach continues to use an ELCC approach to quantify the reliability benefits of the various resource types. The marginal add here is that for firm resources, we're now using a UCAP, a derived calibrated UCAP approach instead of just the installed capacity, which is what we used in the current IRP approach. So we're able to more greatly compare resources with their effective capacity, not just installed capacity versus versus an ELCC for some resources. Move the slide deck forward, please. Yeah, I think that's next steps.
Thanks, Donald.
All right, thank you. I'll pass it off to the next presenter.
Yeah, I think, Nathan, before you wrap up, just picking up that question from Miriam that I'll ask Aaron to speak to shortly and just phrase the question for the benefit of others. It's a question about one of the topics here where there are options in the path forward. So I also want to just take the chance to say for remaining questions, whether it's right now at the end of this webinar or in email very soon, as Nathan outlined at the start, some of the other open topics, as part of this proposal you've heard today include moving to PCAP Prm for LSE planning purposes. You've heard Jimmy propose the changes on the resolve updates, and perhaps there are questions about that. And then one of the TBD items, as Aaron phrased it, was behind the meter storage and how that's modeled in ServMN and resolve, perhaps moving from modeling it as being dispatched on the supply side to being a load modifier. So just calling out a few of the sort of open topics we've covered here, and yeah, handing to Aaron and then Nathan to wrap up.
Okay, so Miriam McCoon asked a question: RDT data entry questions. Are LSEs going to use marginal ELCCs for all resources, regardless of whether they are for incremental procurement? If so, will the marginal ELCCs LSEs are supposed to use for any specific resource vary by year in the same way the MTR ELCCs vary by year? So yeah, I think the answer in terms of the RDT is that it will be released together with the RDT, how LSEs will enter their resources, and that the template will populate appropriately. The specific question about marginal and how that may change over time in part will depend on the use of an average ELCC approach versus a marginal ELCC approach, and where staff decide to land on that. So I think that's a question that we're seeking stakeholder input on. But yeah, in a strict marginal approach, the marginal would change in each year. So all of the storage, for instance, would get accredited at the marginal ELCC for storage in that year. and then the marginal ELCC for storage in the next year. So that's the theory of how a marginal ELCC would work.
Thanks, Aaron.
And Neil, two other questions did come in kind of in the meantime that I think are both Jimmy. But if we need a minute or two to cover those, maybe I can go through next steps and we'll circle back.
I can take them now or later. So
if you can take them now, go for it, Jimmy.
Okay. First one is from Jim. So Jim Heimlich. He's asking, is the proposal to change the ELCC surface by pairing solar with storage and having wind as a standalone curve finalized, or is it still up for consideration? I think that's more directed to CPUC staff. So, Nathan?
Yeah, good point, Jimmy. It's still up for consideration. So, Jim, if you have thoughts, please let us know.
Okay, and then there's a second part of the question that I think is more in my court. He says, also, did I hear correctly that we will have two separate ELCC forecasts, one for 30 MMT and one for 38? Okay. Regardless, we should still only have one ELCC surface though, since it's defined based on penetration, correct? So I can confirm that, yeah, the plan is to have those two portfolios developed by Resolve using the same ELCC surface. You'll be on different points in them in the end. Probably, more renewables in the 30 MMT are likely. So you'll be at kind of a lower marginal, higher total ELCC in general, but the same surface would be used in both cases. And then I think the other part that we'll have two separate ELCC forecasts, one for 30 and one for 38. I think that's maybe a question for Aaron. I think the answer is yes.
Yes, yeah, that's the intent. So LSEs will be planning for two different GHG targets. And so we will derive from Resolve runs and system portfolio forecasts two different 38 and 30 MMT portfolios, which will be put into Servum. And so, yes, there will be two separate LCC studies. And yeah, just to clarify, those studies are different studies than the studies that will develop the surface that goes into Resolve. So the LSE plan studies are using a specific portfolio and tracking the ELCC changes over time, whereas the study for Resolve is sort of starting from scratch and drawing out this broad solar and storage surface that allows Resolve to pick different portfolios within that.
Thanks, Aaron. And let's see, the other question is from Doug Karpa. I think I missed it, but would there be an annual ELCC calculated and reported out? It sounds like that with the use of the 2D surface, that's a matter of assessing where the portfolio is year by year to look up the ELCCs for each. Is that correct? So yes, they should be the portfolio ELCC for the combined solar and storage portfolio reported out for each year that Resolve runs. Resolve is not going to run every single year between now and 2045, but for the years that are run, one of the standard outputs will be the total solar plus storage ELCC. And then if you want to break that capacity out further, if you want to determine what part the storage should be attributed to the storage or the solar, that's more of a attribution question, and that wouldn't be reported out.
And that's all in the context of running Resolve, not in what LSE plans use for resource accreditation.
Which might get us towards Mark's question that just came in right after that. Mark, we might need a tad more input from you on exactly which ELCCs you're referring to, because I think we've covered a few different use cases for a few different types over the last hour and a half or so. So let us know in the Q&A box if you've got more detail there, or if Neil just answered your question. Otherwise, I'll just hop into next steps and try to wrap this up. So there's three big buckets of next steps that we have here on the slide. First is for inputs and assumptions. So we mentioned earlier that a revised scoping memo is somewhat imminent. I would expect it later this year. And it would be expected to provide details on the process for developing the complete INA for this cycle, which is what Ali had described as being the INA work product for basically late this year, back in an earlier part of this webinar. Second subbullet here is CPUC staff expects to finalize the 2022 INA document, including the stakeholder process and the schedule I just mentioned. And that we would expect to hold a modeling advisory group or multiple ones to cover specific INA topics and get stakeholder input, especially for, call it big or new things that we might float for that INA. Next bucket is LSE plan filing requirement templates. So PUC staff is seeking to finalize these templates by June 15th, 2022. You could hear some urgency in mine and James's voice during that part of the presentation for the work that we have to do and any input you might have coming from this webinar on it. Time is of the essence, and please use the IRP data request email address that's in the second sub-bullet here, should you have anything that you haven't been able to get out on the table here today. We also expect to hold informal office hours after that June 15th ruling for each group of LSEs by type to answer any questions and facilitate IRP development. I think folks that have been involved in the process should remember that from last time. Last bucket is that we expect to hold our next modeling advisory group webinar in early June to present the reliability modeling results to be used in finalizing the LSE plan filing requirement templates. So basically the work that we covered kind of in the middle of today's agenda. We know that we'll also have to revisit kind of some other things that were raised today about some of the more conceptual points of, methodologically and technically, how do you do certain things? And then process-wise, is there stuff that we want to do after the timeline that we're talking about here, which is really just focused on 2022? Do we eventually want to build a process by which reliability things like this get covered and determined that's predictable, transparent, et cetera? Because we know that that's something that stakeholder community has asked for before. Another thing that we want to mark right here is that for modeling parties, which we know is a subset of you, but we hope that what we provided today helps get you started to the extent that you want to model in parallel with us in the lead up to that early June date in the last bullet. We hope that we gave you the information that you needed. If you feel like you don't have it, please do reach out directly. It would help also for you to maybe just reach out to announce yourselves so that we can kind of know how big is the community of folks that are actually trying to model along with us, and for us to think about, what's the next juncture, what's the next part of the process where someone who wants to model in parallel could actually get their information out and have it be part of this conversation. That June date would be logical, but we'd want to think about that and maybe could have a smaller conversation about it. Otherwise, I'll just pause here, see if there's any other questions that have come up while I've been talking. Looks like we just have the one from Mark that we're working on resolving. Mark, if you want to hang on for a bit, we can maybe resolve for you as others start jumping off. I do want to give folks part of their day back. They've already stayed 15 minutes late with us on some very complex topics. So just checking with Neil and anyone else. Is there anything else that we needed to tie off before adjourning?
No, I think that's it. We've really appreciated all the interaction and then yeah, well done to the team on getting through a lot of material and all the thinking that's been involved in that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much to the team. Thanks very much for all your patience for the last 2 hours and 15 minutes, and thanks in advance for your participation, input, and engagement on all of this going forward, because it's going to be a pretty big lift. We think it represents kind of an evolution, a refining of IRP. We are always seeking to improve, and we want to do it with you and with your input. So much appreciated. We'll let you go now. If there's anyone else that has a question or anything like that, feel free to drop it in the Q&A or feel free to raise your hand. A couple of us will stay on for the next couple of minutes just in case there's something lingering. But otherwise, thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon.